Hello everyone, welcome to Step 421 class. We'll continue studying cluster sampling, but now it will be about two-stage cluster sampling. So in two-stage cluster sampling, samplings are done in two stages. In the first stage, we select clusters. And second stage, we select element within each sampled cluster. The sampling unit for the first stage sampling is called primary sampling unit, and the sampling unit for the second stage sampling is called the secondary sampling unit. In two-stage cluster sampling, PSU is cluster and SSU is element. We take observations from the secondary sampling units, so which is element ones that are sampled from the from the sampled cluster. Okay, the following figures gives an illustration of the comparison between the first stage sampling and the second stage sampling. In the first stage sample, we select clusters, and then once you select cluster, we observe everything, right? We observe every units, every element. However, in two-stage cluster sampling, we select, so the black ones are sampled one, and so we basically have less samples. Okay. Now we introduce some notation associated with the cluster sampling. So in the population level, the notation is exactly the same as the single stage cluster sampling in week 13 lecture in the last class. So basically, subscript I, capital I, denotes the cluster population. So cluster level population, and then within cluster I, we have element, right? Set of elements, and then we observe element y values for element j for cluster I, and mi is the cluster size for cluster I, and so total we have a sum. We can write it as a sum of the cluster totals, something like that. Now in the sample level, we have additional notation. In stage 1 sampling, we select Si, which is a subset of the Ui, so that is the sampled clusters. And then from the sample cluster, we have information of how many elements are there in the cluster. So we observe Mi, but we do not observe every. So Ti is the summation j equal to 1 to mi yij. So we do not observe. So in single stage sampling, we observe Ti, but here we don't observe Ti because we don't observe every element in the cluster. Stage 2 sampling, we have a small sui, I mean subscript si. So sorry, there are so many s's in this notation, but yes, that's already that I know that's quite confusing. So that is a subscript of script UI, and it's in the set of sampled element. So we basically it's a population. SU is UI is a population, and SI is the sample for cluster I. And then using sampled element, we observe sample element so that we can compute the sample mean and then multiply by capital Mi to get Ti hat. And Mi is small mi is the number of elements. So this is the population size, and this is the sample size. Okay. So here's a summary of the features of the two different sampling designs. For stage 1 cluster sampling, we have a complete enumeration of the cluster elements, and then the cluster population parameters are observed. Okay, because we observe everything, every element. By stage sampling, we have a sampling, so we don't observe all these population parameter, but we can estimate it from the sample, right? So the main reason for considering two-stage cluster sampling instead of single-stage cluster sampling is the cost efficiency. Since the element, so the elements are likely to be correlated. So that means we may have effective sample size to be smaller than the true sample size, the real sample size. So it's kind of a waste of money, some sense. So it makes sense to use sampling to reduce the number of observations in the same clusters, and then increase the number of sampled clusters to achieve the efficiency gain. So it's better to spend the resources to sample more PSUs and small number of SSUs per PSU. So this is a kind of a sample size or location problem. Sample size determination. It's how to choose Ni and how to choose M. So this will be covered in this class. Okay.